Traversing the Frontier, How the Oregon Trail Changed America. Several events in American history have shaped the nation, both literally and figuratively. However, nothing compares to the expansion and settlement that the Oregon Trail provided in the early to middle 1800s. There is a lot of history behind the trail, its significance during the time people utilized it, and its lasting impact on the history of the United States of America. The Oregon Trail offered an excellent, albeit dangerous, method of getting from one side of the country to another via a pathway that stretched from what is now the Midwest all the way to Oregon. The Oregon Trail began near Independence, Missouri, and stretched all the way across the nation in a 2,170-mile trek to Willamette Valley in Oregon. That is, it meandered through part of the territory that would later become Kansas and nearly the entirety of Nebraska and Wyoming. As wagon train riders traveled further west, they encountered the lands of Idaho and Oregon. Interest in moving west into the wild terrain of the frontier territory spiked after Lewis and Clark completed their journey to the Pacific with the Corps of Discovery expedition. Along with Lewis and Clark in their excursion to traverse the newly gained Louisiana Purchase, fur traders sent various parties to establish posts adjacent to the Columbia River. However, though these movements were critical in sparking interest in American expansion westward, the emigration process that would later make headlines did not begin until Marcus Whitman and his wife Narcissa Prentice made the trip together, thus proving that even families could take this dangerous route over the new land. As they did, they established a mission with the Nez Perce Native Americans in an attempt to spread the white man's medicine to the Indians in the form of Christianity conversion. Once it was proven that everyone could make the trip as long as they were careful and cautious on the dangerous journey, which will be expounded upon later, emigration skyrocketed. In the years of 1843 to 1847, as many as 8,000 people had made the trip to Oregon. There was an even larger spike in use of the parallel wagon wheel ruts when gold was discovered in the hills of California, and 10,000 plus people took to the trail in the hopes of striking it rich. However, braving the road was not something for the faint of heart. Many dangers presented themselves on the Oregon Trail. In order to ensure arrival at the end, pioneers had to plan accordingly. The weather, the terrain, and the inhabitants of the land, such as animals and Native Americans, did not take kindly to intruders. Oftentimes, pioneers had to risk fording rivers without knowing if they would make it across. Many times these rivers were full of snakes, like water moccasins. There was also quicksand that would rapidly swallow the narrow wheels of prairie schooners. Once wagon riders had made it through the murky depths of the Big Blue River and managed to avoid any quagmires of quicksand, they found themselves surrounded by the vast Great American Desert, an appellation for the Great Plains before they were known as they are today. In Nebraska, a portion of the trail exists known as the Great Platte River Road, which stretches from Fort Kearny to Fort Laramie. During times of high traffic on the trail, the great lines of wagon trains were described as vari-colored wagon covers, resembling a great serpent crawling and wriggling up the valley. Here, wagon trains would go on for miles and miles, stretching into the distance. In fact, this portion of the road is marked with a monument known as the Great Platte River Road Archway Monument, which spans the entire width of the present-day two-lane Interstate 8. As they passed through the desert terrain of Nebraska, hopeful settlers laid eyes on Chimney Rock, a great mass of rock jutting out of the prairie land that signified mountains were ahead. For immigrants, this was an exciting time on the trail, though it also caused some nerve-wracking uncertainty because many had never experienced such terrain before. Aspiring settlers then arrived at Fort Laramie, where pioneers would mingle with one another, trade for goods necessary to continue their journey, and even encounter Native Americans. Most often, they tried to help in navigation and avoid conflict as much as possible, even though they feared change as the settlers continued to invade the ever-fading sanctity of their lands. However, settlers could also take brief periods of respite and repair any wagon damage if necessary. Otherwise, forts were used to swap stories of the great journey with others who shared the experience. In fact, all 6 of the forts on this trail were used for these similar purposes. One pioneer in particular, Amelia Knight, kept a journal about her life on the trail with her family. She said that mornings took 3 hours of preparation. Trailgoers would arise at 4 a.m., get everything ready, and be ready to go by 7. Oftentimes, people elected to walk because of the wagon seats being so uncomfortable and rigid. At noon, they would stop for a quick lunch before continuing again. Their goal was always at least 16 miles a day, and in this way the trip took the pioneers almost 5 months to complete. The trip often forced future settlers to eat bread, beans, and bacon on a consistent and irritating basis. They also struggled to maintain a water supply on the Oregon Trail. The trip was also incredibly monotonous, as they were traversing desert land in a repeatedly jolting fashion aboard the covered wagons. Other dangers that presented themselves to pioneers included disease, namely cholera. Most often the disease was deadly. It would strike a perfectly well-abled person without notice, giving them a fever, occasional bouts of unconsciousness during the afternoon, and they would be dead by the end of the day. Combine this with the other accidents such as fording and attacks, and as many as 20,000 people died while trying to make this almost always fatal journey. For those that did make the cut through the dangerous elements of terrain and disease, the Oregon country gave pioneers a chance for new life and new opportunities to settle in unexplored lands. They wanted to escape the control that occurred on the eastern half of the country in favor of the freedom and the ever-expanding territories out west, and they found that escape in Oregon. The Oregon Trail stands for a major transition in American history, symbolizing one of the many times in history when people started heading west in the search for a new life and new opportunity. It all relates back to the American dream of freedom and individuality. Everyone who sought settlement in the West hoped for a chance to begin anew and get away from their old lives and their past. People continued utilizing the trail until railroads started being built across the country. In fact, by the time the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, people barely ever used the Oregon Trail because it was much easier to travel by locomotive than wagon. Even though transportation changed, historians will never forget the pivotal changes that the Oregon Trail brought about in regard to westward expansion and the settlement of new territory.